We are talking today about parks and recreation. Always kind of fun, certainly kind of necessary right now when everybody's homebound. It's kind of nice to have open space to go to. I know some cities and states have shut down local parks just to minimize crowding and people coming together and getting too close to one another, but certainly we all need to get outside, get some fresh air, stretch our legs, and just enjoy nature. It can be very calming, very relaxing, reduces stress. Lots of studies show the social and health benefits of access to open space. So hopefully during this time of lockdowns, all of you are getting out as much as you can and enjoying open space as much as you can while practicing proper social distancing, of course. All right, so talking about Parks and Rec planning. As your activity for today's lecture, I want you to think about the amenities for a park geared towards these different groups. So what amenities would be nice for senior citizens, children under 6, children 6 to 12, teenagers, young adults, families. So think about how park amenities and facilities can serve different age groups and different needs, and list those out in the Canvas site. So I will actually go do that right now before I forget. Okay, moving along here. So history of parks planning. Historically, parks, or open space anyway, not necessarily parks as we commonly think of them, have been a part of cities from the beginning. So back in the day, open space was used as pasture, so grazing land for common grazing land. So Boston Commons, the open space that we've all heard of, that space was actually used as a common pasture for cattle, sheep, and other grazing animals in Boston prior to it becoming a park. The spaces were used for militia training. If you remember back to the beginning of the semester, if you can remember back that long, it feels like 100 years ago, we talked about Savannah, Georgia, and how the blocks in Savannah, Georgia, designed by Oglethorpe, each of the blocks had common open space in them in the middle. In that space, one of the main purposes of that open space was as the militia training ground. So, these ideas of open space have been incorporated into cities for a long time, but the idea of open space as recreation is a newer concept that's come around in the last 150 years or so. So in 1857, we had Central Park. And again, if you remember way back to the beginning of class, we talked about New York and how they put the grid pattern of streets into New York. And the original plan for the city had grid streets all the way up Manhattan Island with no preserved open space. And so in 1857, recognizing the need to have some kind of green space and open space in the city, they set aside Central Park. And Frederick Law Olmsted designed the park, and it kind of set the precedent for these large urban parks as a way to provide recreation space for city residents. Residents could take the air. This was still back in the time when sort of the scientific consensus around disease was that it was caused by bad air. And so taking the air was considered a healthy activity, to take fresh air and get away from the smog and pollution of the urban environment. And that's what these parks were intended to do. 1872, Yellowstone was designated as the world's first national park. So prior to this point, parks were seen as a local amenity, a local need, and so they were managed by local governments. And then in 1872, Ulysses S. Grant set aside Yellowstone as the first national park, and the reason for its preservation was the unique natural setting and assets. It wasn't as seen as a place for people to go. I mean, tourism was becoming a trend, but Yellowstone at this time was still pretty far out there and not easily accessible. But because of simply its natural character, there was a desire to protect and preserve that from development. And then in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the rise of the progressive era saw the need for playgrounds and began to push this idea of parks as recreational space. So began to recognize the importance of play and recreation to benefit children's health. And so parks began to transition from simply just open space to take the air and very passive spaces into more active recreational spaces. So who provides parks and recreation? It happens at multiple levels of government. So we have national parks and recreation areas. These tend to be very large, set aside to preserve unique natural features and historical places. State parks and recreation areas. So here in Wisconsin, we have a pretty significant network of state parks. And so if you click here, find a park, you can see the map here, and you can see all the different parks across the state. So a pretty significant network of parks and open space. They provide a variety of recreational opportunities from camping, bicycling. Some provide hunting and trapping in hunting season. Others provide sledding hills. All sorts of fun can be had at your state and national parks. And counties, not all counties have county parks, but some do. There are other entities that provide recreational amenities. So regional rec authorities, school districts provide significant playgrounds and so forth. Cities provide a range of parks. So here in River Falls, we have a pretty significant network of parks here in River Falls. Again, providing a variety of amenities. So we have from small little pocket parks, like where's the one? Let me scroll down here. To big neighborhood parks like Hoffman Park, right? Or big community parks like Hoffman Park, which has a lot of amenities, a lot of facilities, a lot of recreational opportunities. That big baseball park, it's got the disc golf, it's got hiking trails, all of those things in that big community park there, Hoffman Park, to even small neighborhood parks like the one on my street. I'm trying to find it here, which just provides basically a little playground and a seating area just a few houses down from my house. Not a big park, not a lot of amenities, but just a nice little place that neighborhood kids can go play. There's also a dog park, right, which is super important. People like to have places to go play with their dogs. And the private sector does provide parks as well. Oftentimes in new developments, part of the development will include a neighborhood park. It's oftentimes funded and maintained by the neighborhood association. So it's not open technically to the public. It's only open to people in that neighborhood, but it does provide recreational amenities for the people who live there. So what do we use parks and open space for? Lots of things, right? You can have engagement with nature. So there's places to hike, bird watch, paddle, fish. Hunting and fishing is a big part of parks and open space and recreation areas. Preservation of historic spaces and assets. So recognizing the importance of those historic assets and preserving them is a key part of our parks and rec systems. Preserving the unique environmental and cultural features. Again, that's what was the foundation for the creation of Yellowstone National Park, was the unique natural character of that area. Providing sports facilities, so ball fields, soccer fields, football fields, basketball courts, all of those things. Providing a place for people to exercise, play, hold festivals and events here in River Falls. There's a few places where these things happen. So they're in downtown at the little Veterans Memorial Park. They have weekly concerts in the summertime. The amphitheater on campus also has concerts in the summertime, so using those facilities to bring the community together and give some cultural experiences. And trying to balance these needs can be a really significant challenge, right? You probably don't want people hiking and biking while others are hunting in the same space, right? So you need to figure out what the best use of the property is uses may change over time. So during hunting season, oftentimes you'll see like parts of state parks close down to allow for hunting. So trying to ensure that all users have access can be a challenge. And the benefits of Parks and Rec space, they provide amenities for residents, things for them to do, facilities for them to play at. There's safe environment for recreation. There's oftentimes supervision at local parks, or there's actual formal programming for kids. So city sports leagues, supervised play times, supervised youth programs, senior programming, right? All of those things are oftentimes provided by city parks and rec services. There's an opportunity for community building, bringing people together in open space is important. So this is an example of the picture here in River Falls, the ball field, bringing together the community to watch baseball, right? It's an opportunity for neighbors to get to know one another, and come together, build that social capital. They provide environmental services, so drainage, air and water quality, cooling. Urban forests and green space can help reduce the urban heat island effect. So there's a significant benefit to providing Parks and Rec space, both in terms of recreational opportunities, but also in terms of the environmental benefits we get from open space. And there's economic benefits as well. So there's research that shows that properties in proximity to open space can sell for up to 20% higher. They can be more valuable, so the city will collect more property tax from those properties, helping to fund Parks and Rec services, and the property owners will benefit as well from a potentially higher sales price. So quality of life is becoming a much more important part of economic development. Employees are looking for communities with a high quality of life and choosing to live in those communities. So when you have an extensive Parks and Rec system and you have lots of these amenities, it makes your community more attractive to these employees and prospective employers, and makes you contributes to more successful economic development and a higher quality of life. And these facilities can bring in money, right? If you have a ball field, sports tournaments are big money. The traveling softball leagues, traveling baseball leagues, traveling soccer, all of those sports programs, the people come in for those big tournaments. They're spending money at local hotels, they're spending money at local restaurants, they're shopping at local stores. So they can be an enormous economic opportunity for cities to cash in on those parents bringing their kids to these sports tournaments. So they are an economic development opportunity in their own right. So cities are typically the primary Parks and Rec provider. They provide the space for recreation as well as the services. So communities will provide different services and amenities across based on their local priorities and local values. So in a community that has a large aging population, you may see more things like senior centers, golf courses, more passive recreation. Whereas in a community with lots of families, you might see skate parks and basketball courts, those kinds of things. So think about the community where we did our land use activity in class, Horseshoe Bay, Texas, right? Remember I talked about that and how they have 5 golf courses in the town because it's a retirement community and golf is a priority there. So, it just depends on the characteristics of your community as to what services and amenities you are going to provide. And it can be a challenge, right? If you have differing priorities, trying to find adequate funding to provide for the diversity of expectations in your community can be difficult. There's generally support for building new facilities. You can get sponsorships, you can get, people will vote on bonds to build a new park or purchase land for a new park. But once that facility is built, trying to maintain it can be an enormous challenge. And so cities oftentimes will invest really heavily in expanding their park system and then find out down the line they don't have the money to maintain all the improvements that they've made. And there's also just preserving environmental features in open space can be an issue if you have high demand for amenities and facilities. That can diminish some of the environmental benefits you get from open space. If you're building, big parking lots to let people access space, or, you're building ball fields and those kinds of things, you're reducing the environmental characteristics to provide those facilities. And cities are challenged to provide a variety of services, not just amenities and facilities, but also services and programming. So, the expectations for the very young to the very old can be very different, and cities need to balance those challenges based on the characteristics of their community. So to address these challenges, cities will oftentimes develop a Parks and Open Space Master Plan, and begins like any planning process. Many of the planning processes we've talked about, you have to inventory your existing facilities and programs, figure out where you're at right now, what your city offers in terms of programming, what the existing facilities and condition of your facilities are. So we've got 5 parks in town. One has a skate park, one has hiking trails. We have a playground, but it's old and starting to get worn and needs to be either replaced or significantly rehabilitated, right? You want to understand the existing conditions of your community and the facilities that you already have. You want to look at the demographic characteristics of your community. Are we an aging community? We need to focus our services on that population. Do we have a lot of young families and we have lots of young kids? We need to focus on that. What is our community and how can we best serve it through the Parks and Rec programming and facilities? Then you want to go out and talk to people, right? You want to engage with the public, identify what their needs are, what their desires are for the Parks and Rec system, to make sure that you're investing money into those facilities and amenities that the public actually supports. Because at some point you're going to come asking them for more tax revenue to pay for necessary facility improvements, and if you're putting in the facilities that they want and support, you're more likely to get that funding to do those improvements. So you want to make sure you do extensive and meaningful public engagement. There are Parks and Rec standards set by the National Recreation and Parks Association. We'll talk about in a little bit. That's kind of a baseline or a benchmark for the number of facilities you should have in your community. It's not a requirement by any stretch, but at least gives you an idea of kind of how to gauge whether or not you're providing adequate facilities. And you want to develop your goals and priorities and figure out how you're going to pay for it. And it's important when you're actually doing your budgeting, not just to come up with the money to pay for new stuff, but how you're going to maintain it. Because once you invest in something and build it, you're going to be maintaining it forever, right? So you need to think about how that happens when you're providing new facilities. So these are those NRPA standards that I talked about. This is, again, just a benchmark that cities can use to gauge how effective they are in providing facilities to their community. So you can look down at the different amenities that they capture here. So things like a baseball stadium, the standard is 1 per 7,000 people. This table here is actually for some work I did in the city of Bastrop, Texas. So that's why there's standard, existing, required. That's the city population and the location. So the standard for a baseball field is 1 per 7,000 people. They have 6 in Bastrop, 2 different sites. So you want to know the location. Is it within half mile of your most population? So they don't need any baseball fields. Softball fields, you need 1 per 5,000. You might ask, why do we need more softball than baseball fields? Oftentimes because softball is played by girls and also by adults. So you have more demand for softball fields because you oftentimes have adult softball leagues that are co-ed, and baseball is typically played by youth boys. Not always, but oftentimes. So the softball you need more because the adults co-ed teams play and the girls play. Football, soccer is growing in popularity, and so we're seeing a lot more demand for soccer fields in communities. But again, it gives you an idea of how to just when you do your inventory, you can actually look and see, how do we rate compared to these standards. So again, just gives you an idea of how communities can assess their facilities that they're offering. So access to parks is a key issue. You want between a quarter to a half mile access for some level of recreation is the standard. So people can feel comfortable letting kids walk or ride their bikes to a neighborhood park. Everybody in the community has access to some kind of open space. It doesn't have to be like a big Hoffman Park style facility, but it could be, again, like the one in my neighborhood that's just a small playground and a couple of benches, right? It's not a huge park, not a huge investment, but it is a nice open space amenity available in my neighborhood. And so you want to have those scattered throughout your town to allow everyone some proximity to open space. You want to think about how these spaces are connected. So again, would I feel comfortable letting a child ride their bike or walk to the neighborhood park? Is it safe for them to do so? And thinking about trails. So here in River Falls, we have a pretty extensive trail system that runs both along the Kenny River as well as through town. So we have bike lanes and walking trails throughout the community that can be used both for recreation as well as transportation. So you can actually get around town via the bike lanes and the trail system, which is a nice amenity for the community because you're not dependent on cars and you have safe access to get around town. And this idea of a park system is really about providing a system. So not every individual park is going to provide the same services and facilities. And kind of scaling up how you want to think about your park system is a pocket park would be a very small space, right? Maybe has a few benches, some shade trees. You can see an example here, right? This is a vacant lot in a downtown, similar to like Veterans Park in downtown River Falls, where there may have been a building here at one point that burned down or was just demolished for whatever reason, and they've turned it into just a nice little green space. So this kind of pocket park here provides a respite from the urban environment, gives you some shade, gives you a nice place to sit and take a break. Just a nice amenity to have. So neighborhood parks tend to have playscapes, a little more facilities. Maybe they have a few grills, picnic benches, maybe a small pavilion, that kind of thing, scattered in the neighborhoods, providing, again, just a recreational opportunity for that particular neighborhood. Community parks would be something like Glen Park here in River Falls, where you've got the bocce ball the pickleball courts. I think it's pickleball, whatever it is. You've got the pavilion, you've got the neighborhood, the city pool. So not a huge space like Hoffman Park, but a good sized park that provides a number of different facilities. Sports complex would be like the ball fields at Hoffman Park. Special use would be the fairgrounds or a skate park. So think about like the rodeo grounds here that the university has, right? That would be a special use park. And then your open space and green belts. So here in River Falls, that would be like the land along the Kenny, that undeveloped space that allows for hiking and those kinds of kind of more passive recreational opportunities. And so this is what accessibility looks like. This is, again, Bastrop, Texas, and they did, this is a gap analysis. So they actually did a half-mile buffer around all of their public parks in Bastrop, and you can start to see actually where there are gaps in access to open space. So these light green fields that don't have buffers around them, those are private parks or some other form of private open space. But you can see for the city itself, in terms of public open space, where those, that half-mile buffer allows for accessibility, and some pretty significant chunks of neighborhoods where there's not accessibility to open space. This is a big state park, is this big green space here, but a lot of these neighborhoods here don't have access to parks and open space within a half mile, or at least city-operated parks and open space. So this is the kind of gap analysis you want to perform to actually think about, if we're going to provide these amenities and these services to our communities, are we providing them equitably? does every resident in our community have some access to parks and open space in proximity to their home? And what oftentimes you find when you start doing these gap analyses is that your low income, your minority neighborhoods are often the ones least served by these public facilities. And so you want to think about equity in terms of planning new parks and rec facilities, where you're going to locate things, and how you can make sure that all residents have equitable access. So you want to think about when you're considering developing a new park or improving park facilities and so forth, you want to think about what's the usage of the park and where is it going to be located. You wouldn't want to put a sports complex in the middle of a residential neighborhood. Those typically have big lights, lots of traffic, especially during tournaments, those kinds of things, lots of noise. So it may not be a great neighbor. So you want to think about that when you're considering where to locate it. Trails, you oftentimes get resistance to putting trails through neighborhoods because people fear that trails are going to bring in crime and undesirable people to their neighborhood. But for the most part, criminals are lazy and they're not going to walk very far to do nefarious things. And so, it's not like they're going to go hiking a mile down a trail to go rob somebody. They're going to stick to where the pickings are easy. So, but there is resistance to putting in trails, something you're going to have to deal with. You want to think about what's a neighborhood like. So if you're planning a new park in a neighborhood, is it, a bunch of old people? Maybe you're near a senior living center. Are you going to want to put in a skate park next to the senior center? Probably not, right? You're going to get a bunch of broken hips. So, maybe in a park in near the senior center, you want to put in, more benches and walking trails and amenities like that. And then you put the skate park, in the neighborhood where the young families are living, because that's what the kids want to play on. Think about a dog park in downtown, right? If you've got, very dense urban space, not a lot of places for people to take their dogs and walk them, a dog park would be a great amenity to have in that space because, people who live in those apartments and so forth can take their dogs, give them a space to run around in and play. And you want to think about what opportunities there are to put in rec facilities and amenities. So using floodplains for open space and trails. Because when it rains, nobody's going to be hiking generally anyway, so the water can fill up those spaces. It's not really going to hurt anything because there's not a lot of facilities put in there. But you have open space that you're using and have access to when the weather's nice and it's dry. So here in River Falls, if you're driving north on 63 on the east side of town, if you look over to the right past Division Street, there's a big open space there that has some soccer goals on it. That's a big drain field. So when it's wet and rainy, that fills up with water. But when it's dry, that's a soccer field. And so that's a great kind of dual use facility that serves as a stormwater collection point, but also a recreational amenity. So that's a great way to use the same space for multiple purposes. Thinking about oddly shaped lots that are not suitable for development, they can become a pocket park or a neighborhood park, right? Just a nice amenity on a kind of a weird space that nobody's going to use anyway. And slopes and other terrain that are not suitable for development. Again, maybe you wouldn't use them for intense recreational, but they can be open space and just preserved with maybe some hiking trails, those kinds of things that take advantage of them not being developed. So when you think about programming and the services that you're going to offer through your Parks and Rec program, you want to think about, again, your demographics and public engagement. What do people want? What do people need? Do we need senior activities? Something for senior citizens to do? So things like, it may sound crazy, but quilting is super popular. Scrapbooking, genealogy, more passive forms of recreation, bird watching, walking, those kinds of things are great programming for seniors. Whereas for kids, maybe you have, soccer leagues and basketball leagues and those kinds of things, more active programming for the youth. You want to make sure you have an adequate budget and that you're funding it appropriately over time, because once you start offering something, people are going to expect it. And so you need to make sure that you budget appropriately and have that money available year over year over year. You want to think about advertising and promotion to get people involved and make sure that your residents know that these programs are available for them and their kids, and get them signed up and get them engaged. And you want to look at seasonal hiring and programming, so making sure that you can get lifeguards for the city pool, you can have counselors for summer camps that you're offering, those kinds of things. You want to make sure that there are adequate people available to do that. That can be a challenge. Youth today are less likely to work than they were in the past, and so it can be harder to fill some of those seasonal positions that depend on high school kids to fill them. That can be a challenge for cities going forward. But you certainly don't want to offer programs if you can't staff them. And you do have competition with club leagues and school sports. So if you're trying to do city sports leagues, oftentimes kids are more engaged with their traveling baseball team or their school baseball team, and they don't have time to play in city leagues. So that can be an issue as well. But the nice thing about city leagues is that they can oftentimes be a more affordable option. So your low-income residents can benefit from city programming, and their kids can get recreational opportunities that they may not otherwise get through private providers. You want to think about, is the city the right entity to provide this service? So should the city be providing sports leagues? If we have a super active Little League or Pop Warner football and the kids all do that, maybe the city doesn't need to provide that service. But you certainly want to make sure that, if it is not the city providing these programmings, that they're accessible to all residents and are affordable for all residents. Can the city partner with another entity to provide services? So in the case of sports fields, oftentimes what happens is the city, to help support sports leagues, the city will provide the maintenance and upkeep and operating expenses for, say, the baseball fields, and basically use that to subsidize the programming. And so a private entity, Little League or whatever, will provide the programming and actually organize the teams and do that sort of stuff. But since they're not paying to operate and maintain the fields, it's a lower cost. So all residents can afford to do that. So it's a partnership between a private provider and the city to ensure access for all. And so you want to make sure that programs are available to all income levels so that kids aren't excluded for being low income, and that all residents have access to the services and amenities provided. So when we talk about park planning and how you actually design and build parks, the work is oftentimes done by landscape architects and architects, so urban planners don't always get involved in the actual development and planning for parks, but they are involved oftentimes in determining where they're located and what needs to be designed for. So the urban planner will be involved in the decision-making process to decide, okay, we're going to build a sports complex, it's going to go into this part of town, and then the architects and landscape architects will come in and actually do the specific design for the park. So you need to think about, when you're going to design a park, what the usage is going to be, who the audience is, how it fits into the larger system of parks and the larger network of parks to ensure that you're meeting community goals. Determine layout, placement, where things are going to be put, and taking advantage of topography of the property, other natural features that already exist, to design your park and maximize the benefit you get from the space as it currently exists. So you want to think about safety, and so things like visibility from the street. If you look at the top picture here, this is Bryant Park back in the 70s. And as you can see, you've got these tall fences, you've got these walls, lots of trees. Makes it really hard to see into the park from the street. Bryant Park in the 70s and 80s was a crime zone. Lots of undesirable activities going on in there. The public wouldn't use it because it wasn't safe. So criminals were hanging out there, drug deals, prostitution, all of those things were rampant in Bryant Park, and it's because the design of the park itself made it really hard to supervise and police, and made it a scary place for people to go. So this is Bryant Park today. They did a massive redevelopment of the park. They opened up visibility. and made it more welcoming and accessible, which made it a more popular destination. So people started to use it. And once you started to have positive uses of the park, that contributes to pushing out the undesirable uses. So you want to think about how you can design a park to be open and visible, allow for security, allow for multiple uses throughout the day, so people are kind of always there, bringing activity into the space, making it vibrant and active to feel welcoming and safe. You want to think about accessibility, how you can connect the park to your existing trails and sidewalks, making it accessible for people to get to without a car. You want to think about its openness to adjacent properties. So in the case of Bryant Park, by opening up the access to the park to adjoining properties, they've got food trucks and food vendors, so people can grab a sandwich at one of the neighboring properties, walk across the street to the park, grab a chair, grab a table, sit down, eat their lunch, enjoy the open space, enjoy the greenery, and it's connected to the larger neighborhood. And you want to think about negative impacts. You want to think about lighting, noise, parking, all of those things that might have a negative impact on the neighborhood and surrounding uses, and ensure that you design in a way to minimize those challenges. So here's an example of a conceptual master plan for a park. You can see they have ball fields. So ball fields tend to have lights, noise, generate some significant traffic, and so they kind of put them in the middle of the park, and they surrounded it with trees, so you're isolating it from the adjoining properties. So if this were, say, a neighborhood and you had residential uses around the park, by putting the ball fields here, you're minimizing the potential impacts from those spaces. You've got, instead of having like one giant parking lot, you have multiple smaller parking lots, so it improves access and movement through the space. So you're reducing congestion of everybody parking in one space and all trying to get out to the same space, and you've got multiple uses across the park. So again, people can park in proximity to where they're going in the park without having to walk too far. So you're improving the accessibility of the space. So some ways that we actually get parks built. So cities will oftentimes adopt a park dedication ordinance in their subdivision ordinance. So this rule actually requires developers to set aside a percentage of land for park facilities as they're building. So if a developer buys 100 acres to build a bunch of houses, they're then required to set aside 10% of that land as public open space. The benefits to that is that you do provide space for parks, so that the city is not competing with developers to try and buy land to provide parks. So that's a good thing. It puts the burden of new park development on the developers and the people who are actually going to be buying the homes and using that park for the most part. It makes sure that new parks are in proximity to development, because again, it's part of the development process is setting aside land within that development for parks. So you're ensuring that everyone has proximity to parks. And you can work with developers to offset requirements in return for other community benefits. So developer maybe doesn't want to put in a park, you can say, okay, we'll waive the park requirement, but you have to make 10% of the homes affordable, right? So we provide housing, affordable housing for residents. Or, okay, you don't have to put in a public park, but we need land for an elementary school, right? So you can kind of do some trade-offs in terms of what the requirements are to ensure that community needs are met. Some of the challenges that go along with this is that the land that the developer sets aside may not be great for a park. It could be, a random lot way in the back of the subdivision that's not really accessible to the public. So it's, could be a public park, but nobody can get there because it's tucked way back into the subdivision. And so it's not a great amenity for the community. It may not be, the city may not have resources to develop the park. So as development is happening, the developer is saying, okay, here's the land, it's yours, do with it what you will, but the city may not have the money to actually build any facilities on it. And so now the city has to maintain and supervise that lot, even if they don't have the money to put a park on it. So it just creates more headaches for the city to try and maintain these properties scattered throughout the town without proper funding to do so. So some cities have a fee in lieu, which means instead of setting aside land, developers will actually pay a fee. Oftentimes that's per house. So some cities have, it's $250 or $300 per house. And then that money can be used to either build new parks or maintain existing parks. So it's a way to increase funding for the city's Parks and Rec system, but not obligate the city to build a new park in every neighborhood that gets built. So it's a way to still get some benefit for the park system from new development, but not be obligated to put in a new park if the city doesn't have the resources to do so. So some things you want to consider, allowing private development of parks and recreation services. So homeowners associations, we talked about them, oftentimes in new developments, the developer will put in a neighborhood park, and that gets funded and maintained by the neighborhood association. So the homeowners paying fees to their neighborhood association pay for their own park. YMCA, club sports, those are organizations that provide a range of amenities and services to communities. Again, not putting burden on the city, but putting nonprofits or other organizations providing services that cities sometimes do. And there's opportunities for partnerships as well for the city to help out these organizations to ensure that programming is available for all residents. So ways that we pay for parks and recreation amenities and services, cities will oftentimes create nonprofits. So like Friends of the Park organizations, these are nonprofits that do their own fundraising and will fund park improvements and park programming. So, you're leveraging the nonprofit sector and individual private fundraising to help pay for parks and services. Public-private partnerships, sponsorships, getting businesses to put in facilities. So you'll see on benches, you'll see a little plaque that says, Bob and Mary Smith, they paid for that park bench. Or you'll see the Family Fresh Playscape or whatever it might be, right? Getting local businesses to pay for facilities and giving them, a plaque recognizing their donation or whatever. And local fundraising, right? Just getting money from the public to pay for needed facilities. So some other things to consider are regional opportunities. So looking at networks of connected open spaces and habitat preservation. We talked about, or maybe we didn't talk about in this class, but one of the growing trends in park and open space planning is the recognition that we need to save regional connections to allow for animal population migrations and so forth, to make ecosystems more diverse and more resilient. So ensuring we have regional connectivity. Trails, I'm not going to click on the link, but it's a video of a regional trail in Austin where they're connecting different habitats, different preserved open spaces, adding accessibility into open space so people can walk. I mean, it's going to be like a 40 mile long trail when it's done. So you can have, an extensive recreational opportunity for hiking or riding your bike or whatever. Also looking at your school districts as a resource. So, school districts tend to have ball fields, tennis courts, weight rooms, basketball courts, all sorts of things. So cities are partnering with their school districts to make those facilities accessible. Like during the summertime, the city will offer staff to provide access to the school gym during the summertime. And so they'll have basketball leagues and those kinds of things during the summertime using the school district facilities when they're not being used by students. And so here in River Falls, the school has a swimming pool, and they make it accessible to the public, so people can go and lap swim in the mornings and when the school swim team is not using that facility. And so the question you need to ask is, who is the appropriate entity to provide various parks and rec activities? Is it the city? Is it the county? Is it a private sector? Is there a state or federal entity that might be better off doing this? And so we need to think about, who's doing what's needed and who's going to provide it. And if you want to look at some additional resources, you can click on these links here. The benefits of parks goes into just how much actual benefit we get in terms of public health, public safety, increased property values, all of those positive things that come from having a well-designed park system. If you want to look at Glen Park and Hoffman, the master plans that's gone into that, and the Eau Claire Parks Master Plan if you want to see how Eau Claire is planning their park system. And that's the important thing to note, is that we need to think of Parks and Recreation as a system. It's not just an individual park, it's not just an individual program, it's how the entire system works together to provide access to open space, to provide access to recreational programming that is affordable, and providing the right facilities and programming for our community, right? So you want to think about who your community is, what the characteristics of your community are, and put in place a system of parks and open space that meet the needs of that population. So that's it. Don't forget to do the quiz that's due. Have a great day.